Ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and it's been a while since I sat down and provided a good old-fashioned game critique, but as this was a Star Trek game and one that was shaping up to not be complete and utter trash from what I was seeing leading up to its release, I thought this would be a good foray back into what used to be the primary focus of content on my channel. However, if you're looking for a number out of 5 or a number out of 10 here, you won't find one. Assigning an arbitrarily devised numerical formula is merely done for simple psychological factors, and it's not really something I engage in. That said, let's get right into it. So, as with any game review on my channel, we start at the very beginning, which the beginning is always the place where one should start, and for us, that means the options menu. Now, the options menu for this game is not exactly what I would call robust in nature. You have your usual volume sliders and a brightness slider. The resolution options are extremely basic in nature, with 1920 by 1080 being the best standard display option available. Unfortunately, there are no 2K or 4K options available for the game. You also have a language selection of English, French, or Spanish, along with the ability to check a box for full screen and subtitles. And that is quite literally it. As I said, it's definitely not the most promising options menu I've ever seen. Now, the game will let you play with either keyboard and mouse or a controller, and seems to do a good job detecting between the two and automatically switching between prompts. And given the basic nature of the gameplay elements, the options are sufficient enough to get the job done, but remains, at least for me, rather underwhelming. A Star Trek Resurgence would easily be classified as a Telltale Games-style project with a few additions. The game is extremely story-driven, with what the developers classify as, quote, featuring dialogue-driven role-playing and rich, branching storylines, an assertion that I will dispute in some areas, but that's for later on. The game does have a host of extremely simple QuickTime events, where the vast majority of them do not count against you if you aren't staying on top of the prompts. Indeed, for much of the game, if you wait on the prompts, the game will simply sit there waiting for you to input the needed commands. In addition to the QTEs, you will find sections where you will engage in phaser combat. There are a few areas where you will engage in stealth missions, sneaking around guards in order to reach an objective. You will be piloting a shuttle with a couple of different obstacle types to overcome, and then there are also areas where you must run a couple of different mini-puzzles while operating a transporter in order to get a lock on someone. The game does have a lot of dialogue and dialogue options where you can see the outcome of your choices reflected by the opinions of your companion characters. For the story, we'll do a quick non-spoiler elements which will contain just the first 10 to 20 minutes, but we will get into spoiler territory and I'll let you know when and provide a timestamp of when to skip to if you want to avoid spoilers. Now, the game places you in the shoes of not just one, but two main protagonists who are working on the same ship and only actually meet each other once through the whole game, which seemed to be an interesting design choice and an obvious nod to the cartoon series Lower Decks, as that is actually the name of one of the chapters within this game. The first character you play as is Commander Jara Rydek, a half-human, half-Kobliad commander. The second character you will be playing as is Petty Officer Carter Diaz, who is assigned to engineering. The game starts you off playing as Commander Rydek as she is on her way to her new posting on board the USS Resolute, which is a refitted Centaur-class vessel commanded by Captain Solano, who the game purports as being an old friend of Rydek, although that friendship is barely touched on to the point of ultimately being completely irrelevant information. The Resolute is going through its last mad scramble to complete repairs and obtain roughly 20 replacement crew after an accident 6 months prior that very nearly destroyed the ship completely, killing a fair number of her crew, including the ship's first officer, who Rydek is replacing. The Resolute's mission is to pick up a Federation ambassador and take them to mediate a dispute between the Illydians and the Hotari. The Illydians are a technologically advanced race comparable in technology to many other races you see in the Star Trek universe, who had in the past uplifted the Hotari and attempted to utilize them as a means of subjugating the Hotari to mine the Hotari moon, which is rich in dilithium. It is revealed that Starfleet obtains a significant percentage of their dilithium from the Illydians. Recently, the Hotari ousted the Illydians from the moon and took over the dilithium mines completely. However, as they're technologically outmatched by the Elydians, the Hotari have asked for a Federation mediator, despite neither the Hotari nor the Elydians being members of the Federation. Now, the other character you'll play as is Petty Officer Carter Diaz, who is a likable and competent engineer. At his side is Diaz's bro for life, Petty Officer Neely Edsalar, an unjoined Trill. Diaz is your fairly typical bright-eyed, dependable type that simply wants to get out there and explore, exhibiting a youthful enthusiasm all the while. Diaz gets sucked up into numerous situations as a result of the overarching story, and is the only one of the two-player characters that has the option of a romantic interest. Not in his best bud for life Neely, no, but instead in the form of Petty Officer Miranda Maris, who is friends with both Diaz and Edsalar, having previously served on board the Resolute and is returning to the ship in order to replace dead crew members. The story itself is overall well told, and offers a very good take on a traditional Star Trek story arc in many areas, while unfortunately it does fall short in some others. But for that, we'll be going into spoiler territory, so if you don't want to have any spoilers, feel free to skip to the timestamp that is on your screen now. A last chance for spoilers, so pause the video and skip ahead if you need. Alright then, so for spoilers, the main story your character is going to be going through is that the Hotari found ancient alien tech on the moon which allowed them to control a device of immense power. The device is from the Takan Empire, a race of highly advanced people that has existed some 600,000 years prior. The Takan are Star Trek canon, as in Star Trek The Next Generation, the crew came across the entity known as Portal 63 on Delphi Ardu 4. And they did so while in pursuit of a Ferengi marauder in the episode The Last Outpost. Portal 63 was in suspended animation during a slow period for the Empire and was completely unaware the Takan Empire had collapsed and its people no longer existed. Also, it is worth noting as a side tangent that Armin Shimmerman, the actor that played Quark in Deep Space Nine, was also one of the Ferengi in The Last Outpost, which was the first Star Trek episode that showed the Ferengi. But back to the game. The Hotari that found this ancient Takan tech somehow end up getting taken over by ancient Takan fanatics known as the Scions of the Flame. This is done through Takan technology that apparently stores a single Takan within a crystal that can be injected into a new host body where that host undergoes non-visible DNA changes, which allows them to operate Takan tech, which apparently Takan tech can only be operated by Takan. Although this does present a bit of a plot hole, as within the game, these Takan are stored on neatly arranged shelves where the process involves essentially stabbing a person with one. And this begs the question for me, how? After all, the story relates how the Scions of the Flame within Hotari bodies were the ones that actually overthrew the Elydians overseeing the mining operations. But how did the first one come to be injected with a Takan personality? Did these Hotari come across these roughly dagger-sized crystals and simply think, let's just stab each other with this? Now, Star Trek in general is definitely no stranger to plot holes. Hell, in The Next Generation's The Last Outpost, the Takan were purported to be in a massive empire spanning countless star systems and had a population in the trillions, who were then apparently wiped out by a single supernova. This despite the Takan supposedly possessing technology of sufficient power to move entire planets and even stars. We also learned that the Takan invited the Federation to mediate the dispute between the Elydians and the Hotari as a means to seize Starfleet technology for themselves in order to assess the Federation's technological capabilities, deeming them to be a veritable non-threat. It also turns out that the Federation and its borders essentially make up the vast majority of what was formerly the Takan Empire, and the Takan, naturally, seek to destroy the Federation and use its citizenry as host bodies for the countless Takan being stored within those dagger crystal things. Now, through the course of this, you go to Delphi Ardu 4 and meet with Portal 63, who decides to join you to assess these so-called Takan for himself. Eventually, the Scions of the Flame locate and revive a massive ancient Takan ship, and the crew of the Resolute, joined by a Starfleet task force, must combat this vessel, which has a bioforming, which is what they call someone being turned into a Takan, a bioforming weapon based on transporter technology that can turn anyone caught in the beam instantly. Now, through the process of that arc, and we're going back to non-spoiler territory here, so welcome back to those who chose to skip ahead, the game does do a good job in relating a Star Trek-style story with numerous command and interpersonal-based decisions that, while there are very few decisions-based consequences to the decisions that you make, it comes to an ultimately satisfying conclusion, leaving the crew of the Resolute open to what new adventures await them. Now, I've touched on the subject of choices within this game as they are integral to the game design of the story. But these are in actuality the bread and butter gameplay mechanics, so I've kept a lot of that from the story-centric portion of this video, and I'll do my best to relate the design of these choices in a non-spoiler way. As with most games of this style, much of your choices within a game that is advertised as, quote, rich branching storylines really seem to be either ineffectual choice or the illusion of choice. The reality of these branching storylines is quite different from what the developers claim from what I've seen from two separate and complete playthroughs of this game, where in reality the vast majority of your choices do absolutely nothing to alter the story itself outside of whether or not a single character will support you to the end, where if they do not, there will be minor narrative changes, and in one instance a combat change, but afterwards the original story picks up exactly where it left off. This sort of design when it comes to player agency ramrods the decisions you as the player make back into the original on-rails plan for the story, severely limiting the impact of your personal choices to the point of nearly complete irrelevance. And in spite of the story being a fun and engaging one, I noted several dialogue interactions that actively detract from the impact of a Star Trek story itself, as the actions and statements made by some of your fellow Starfleet officers fly in the face of what it means to even be a Starfleet officer within this universe, and any attempt by you to act in the higher ideals of Starfleet are met with scorn by those NPC officers. And conversely, there are other areas of the dialogue choices that very much match the concept of a Starfleet officer willing to put themselves to the task in an effort to protect others and uphold those higher ideals, which, interestingly enough, is typified in the portrayal of Carter Diaz. So in this, it's very much a mixed bag. The rest of the gameplay revolves around mini-puzzles, such as the transporter sequences, which apparently has managed to stump at least one user who was apparently caught on one of these for roughly a single hour, where the solution to these mini-puzzles is to choose the greatest distance between the two lines. You have two waveforms and one of them is static. Merely set your indicator to the lowest point of the static line has, and then wait for the other line's peak to meet up with your indicator, and you're golden. Another large staple of gameplay is the phaser combat sequence, which are simple enough in their own right. You are locked to one or more cover areas that you can roll back and forth between, shooting opponents with your phaser, set on stun of course, and paying attention for an enemy with a blue shield icon to appear, which is a gauge that will fill up. Once full, the person you are protecting will take damage. Stun enough opponents and the game will automatically progress. You also have indicators that an opponent is taking aim at you, and if you are aiming as opposed to ducking behind cover, there's a good chance you'll be shot during this, which for each phaser combat sequence you don't have a health meter, merely once you take 3 hits you go down. Another one of the main gameplay mechanics is the stealthing, which is merely hiding and cover. Thankfully you can still run while crouched, which can speed these segments up quite a bit. There are your usual curiosity gauges from the guards you're attempting to hide from, which can be helpful. However, if you're discovered, you will die to a single disruptor shot and have to start the entire sequence over again. Now, in terms of saving the game operates on a checkpoint system, and there is no manual save option. However, the game does do a good job of keeping track of your progress from area to area, so there won't be very many times where you find yourself repeating dialogue or actions too much. So far, the stability and performance of the game are middling at launch. I noticed numerous stutters and pop-in which, for a game that is fairly graphically basic, seem to speak to actual bugs that need to be resolved within the game rather than any sort of hardware limitation. Also, due to the lack of robustness of the options menu, there is no way for a player to self-diagnose when issues such as these arise. Also, on my first playthrough, I did have 2 full crashes of the game, which forced me to reboot my computer, as I was unable to end the executable via Task Manager, and utilizing Task Kill via command line also had no effect. One of those game crashes actually occurred when the game was attempting to transition to the credits scroll at the end. However, a second full playthrough of the game showed no crashes, so the stability there appears to be intermittent. I did also notice a great many frame rate drops and the pop-in I discussed before. The game definitely needs some optimization work, but it is still in a very playable state. Also, a 4K graphics option definitely needs to be included. And while the game is extremely on rails in terms of its overarching story, the different dialogue options and their effect on the characters, while minimal to the point of non-existent in terms of the broader scope of the game, are interesting enough to warrant at least an additional playthrough or two, whether it be to attempt a best possible scenario or to simply try new options. With games such as this, the overall replay value is going to be lessened due to the heavy focus on a linear story arc. For my 2 playthroughs, I have accumulated a total of 20 hours of playtime, with approximately 14 hours spent on the first playthrough as I combed through the game for every scrap of side content possible, along with double-checking a great deal, and of course, close inspection of different aspects for the formulation of a review. And the second playthrough took roughly 6 hours to complete. After those 2, though, I feel no need to return to the game except at some far into the future later date where I might wish to go through the story again when it's not so fresh in my mind. Unfortunately, the linearity of games such as these, despite their claims of divergent stories, does not lend much to the game's replayability, which may decrease the potential value of the game for many players. Now, overall, as I said, it is a fun Star Trek story, despite the deficiencies that I've outlined here for you today. Engaging and compelling gameplay it simply does not have. However, the story itself is engaging, at least for the first and maybe a second playthrough. It does require some optimization efforts to be made, and the claims of rich branching storylines falls flat on their face. But for me, I would find the game to be average overall and worth picking up on sale, but I personally do not feel it is worth the $40 asking price. So is this game worth it to you? Well, let me know down in the comments below. As a reminder, we do have a SidAlpha Discord that you can get to by simply navigating to discord.gg/SidAlpha, and I hope to see you there. Now, this has been a critique of Star Trek Resurgence, developed by Dramatic Labs and is currently being sold through the Epic Games Store for $40. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and I'll see you next time.